Sherlock Holmes and the Riddle of the Ghostly Organist. Chapter 1. A Most Unusual Letter. The pale winter sun had scarcely risen above the London rooftops when my dear friend Sherlock Holmes burst into our shared lodgings at 221B Baker Street, clutching a letter in his long, nimble fingers. I had been enjoying my morning coffee by the fire, the Daily Telegraph spread across my lap, when his sudden entrance scattered the peaceful quiet of the room. "Watson!" he exclaimed, his gray eyes alight with that familiar gleam that signaled the arrival of a case worthy of his remarkable intellect. "Providence has smiled upon us this dreary morning. We have been presented with what promises to be a most singular puzzle." The change in his demeanor was striking. Just the previous evening, I had watched him slumped in his armchair, gaunt and hollow-eyed, plucking listlessly at his violin strings. Holmes had been in one of his black moods for the past fortnight, alternating between the cocaine bottle and his violin, the latter of which he would scrape mercilessly at unholy hours. The prospect of a new case was welcome indeed, if only to rescue my sleep from his nocturnal musical torments. "What sort of puzzle might that be, Holmes?" I inquired, pouring him a cup of coffee which he accepted but promptly forgot, placing it untouched upon the mantelpiece. Holmes settled into his chair, studying the letter in his hand as if it were a rare specimen. "A ghost story, Watson? Or, rather, a tale of superstition cleverly employed to conceal what I suspect is a most ingenious crime." He waved the letter before me. "This arrived by the first post. It is from Lady Eleanor Blackwood of Ravenscroft Abbey in Dartmoor. She writes that the abbey is being haunted by the spirit of a long-dead organist, whose music echoes through the halls at midnight, though no living hand touches the keys." I raised an eyebrow. "Surely you don't believe in such supernatural nonsense, Holmes?" A thin smile played across his lips as he reached for his cherrywood pipe. "You know my methods, Watson. Where others see the supernatural, I see only the natural not yet explained." He packed the bowl with his strong shag tobacco. "But there is more to this than ghostly music. 3 servants have fled the abbey in terror, and Lady Eleanor's husband, Sir Richard, has taken to wandering the grounds at night armed with a pistol. Most curiously of all, valuable items have begun to disappear. Family heirlooms, silver, and a collection of rare musical manuscripts that Sir Richard's grandfather collected during his travels in Italy." "Thievery disguised as haunting," I mused, watching as he lit his pipe, the sweet, acrid smoke soon filling our sitting room. "A clever enough ruse, I suppose." "Perhaps, but why employ such theatrical methods? Simple burglary would suffice for common thieves." Holmes drew deeply on his pipe. "No, Watson, there is something more elaborate at work here. Lady Eleanor writes that the manuscripts alone are valued at several £1,000s. They contain original compositions by Palestrina and Monteverdi, among others, extremely rare and virtually impossible to sell on the open market without raising suspicion." Holmes paced our sitting room, his dressing gown billowing behind him like a ship's sail. Outside, London lay under a blanket of fog so thick that the buildings across the street appeared as mere shadows. The local police inspector has dismissed the matter as servants' gossip and household misplacement. But Lady Eleanor is convinced something sinister is afoot. The family organist, one Jonathan Graves, died under mysterious circumstances 30 years ago. According to local legend, he was composing a masterpiece when he perished in a fire that destroyed the abbey's east wing. They rebuilt, of course, but villagers claim his restless spirit returns to complete his work. Holmes paused by the window. The abbey itself has quite a colorful history. Built in the 16th century as a Benedictine monastery, it was seized during the dissolution and granted to the Blackwood family by Henry the Maine. Sir Richard is the 9th baronet, and I gather from Lady Eleanor's letter that the family fortunes have waned considerably in recent generations. The estate is mortgaged to its limit, and Sir Richard has been forced to sell off parcels of land to maintain appearances. And you suspect a more terrestrial explanation for these hauntings, I remarked, already anticipating the suitcases we would soon be packing. Invariably, Watson. Ghosts may make convenient culprits, but they rarely have need of silver or musical manuscripts. No, there is human agency at work here. Clever, calculated, and with purpose. Holmes retrieved his forgotten coffee and drank it in a single swallow, grimacing at its now tepid temperature. Lady Eleanor mentions that her brother, Edward Marsden, has come to stay with them. A musician himself, apparently, though not of any particular note or accomplishment. And there's a distant cousin as well, a Miss Sophia Blackwood, who serves as companion to Lady Eleanor's elderly mother, the Dowager Lady Blackwood. Quite a full house for a haunting, I observed. Indeed, and all the more suspects for a crime. Holmes tapped the ashes from his pipe into the coal scuttle. Sir Richard's valet, a man named Perkins, has served the family for 20 years but recently gave notice. Lady Eleanor attributed it to the ghostly disturbances, but I wonder if he might have observed something that gave him cause for alarm, something decidedly more human than spectral. I can see you're already resolved to investigate, I said, rising from my chair. When do we depart for Dartmoor? Holmes consulted his pocket watch. The next train leaves Paddington at 11:15. Pack warm clothing, Watson. Dartmoor in February can be most inhospitable, and I suspect we may need to conduct some nocturnal observations of our own. As I turned to prepare for our journey, Holmes halted me with a gesture. One more curious detail, Watson. Lady Eleanor mentions in her letter that her husband recently received a substantial offer to sell the Abbey from a London businessman named Harrington Voss. An offer Sir Richard declined most vehemently, despite their financial difficulties. Interesting, wouldn't you say? You think this Voss might be connected to the hauntings? I asked, intrigued. Holmes stroked his chin thoughtfully. I think, my dear Watson, that when a valuable property becomes suddenly more valuable with the departure of its inhabitants, one must look beyond spectral explanations. He tapped the letter against his palm. Lady Eleanor reports that the ghostly music began precisely 3 days after Mr. Voss's offer was rejected. A coincidence, perhaps, I suggested. Holmes's eyes twinkled. You know my feelings about coincidences. The universe is rarely so lazy. Now, I suggest you pack your service revolver alongside your warmest socks. Something tells me we may have need of both before this case is concluded. I nodded, remembering the weight of my Army-issue Adams in my hand during previous adventures. It had saved our lives more than once. I shall wire Lady Eleanor to expect our arrival on the afternoon. Train, Holmes continued, already at his writing desk. And perhaps a quick inquiry about this Mr. Voss would not go amiss. Mycroft might know something of the man. He seems to know something of everyone in London worth knowing about. As I headed upstairs to pack, I heard Holmes already consulting his extensive index of newspaper clippings. A new mystery had arrived, and with it, the restoration of his formidable energies. Whatever awaited us at Ravenscroft Abbey, be it ghost or mortal schemer, would soon face the cold light of reason that Sherlock Holmes brought to even the darkest of mysteries. Little did I know then that what awaited us in Dartmoor would test even Holmes's remarkable faculties, and before the case was solved, we would both find ourselves questioning the boundary between the world of the living and that of the dead. For there are times when logic alone cannot explain all that we witness, and the riddle of the ghostly organist would prove to be one such occasion. The game was afoot, and as the morning fog lifted from London's streets, we prepared to confront a mystery that would lead us into the shadowy realm where superstition and crime converge with deadly consequence. Chapter 2. Journey to Ravenscroft Abbey. Our journey to Dartmoor was largely uneventful, save for Holmes's ceaseless examination of the railway timetables, which he scrutinized with the same intensity he might apply to a drop of mysterious blood under his microscope. The winter countryside flashed past our window, bare trees standing like sentinels against the gray sky, occasional farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys, and finally the wild, windswept expanses of Dartmoor itself. "Tell me, Watson," Holmes said, folding his newspaper and peering out at the desolate landscape, "what do you know of Dartmoor?" "Only what I've read," I confessed. "A harsh place by all accounts. Treacherous bogs, sudden mists, and granite tors rising from the earth like the bones of ancient giants. A fitting backdrop for ghost stories," Holmes remarked with a slight smile, "though the true dangers of Dartmoor are far more terrestrial. The bogs alone have claimed countless lives over the centuries. We would do well to stick to established paths during our investigation." As the train pulled into the small station, at Newton Abbot we were met by a closed carriage bearing the Blackwood family crest, a raven perched atop a twisted oak branch. The driver, a weather-beaten man with a face like tanned leather, touched his cap respectfully. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson? Lady Eleanor sent me to fetch you. It's a good hour's drive to the Abbey. Weather's turning, so we'd best be on our way." Indeed, the sky had darkened considerably, and the air carried the sharp scent of approaching snow. As we settled into the carriage, I noticed Holmes's eyes darting across the landscape, absorbing every detail of our surroundings. "Our driver seems to be a mine of local information," Holmes murmured to me. "Let us see what we can extract." Then, raising his voice, he addressed the man. "You've served the Blackwood family long, I take it?" "Aye, sir. 32 years come." "Michaelmas. I remember when the old Baron was still alive. Sir Richard's father, that is. Things were different then." "Different? How so?" Holmes inquired casually, though I recognized the keen interest beneath his seemingly idle question. "The estate was prosperous for one. No talk of selling land or entertaining offers from London. Gentlemen." The driver flicked his whip, urging the horses up a steep incline. "And there were no ghosts at Ravenscroft back then." "You believe in these hauntings, then?" I asked. The driver was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I've heard the music myself, sir. Coming from the Abbey chapel when no living soul was near the organ. Makes a man question what he knows to be true." Holmes leaned forward. "And when did these manifestations begin, precisely?" "About 6 weeks ago, sir. Right after that London fellow, Voss I think his name was, came to call on Sir Richard. Made a generous offer for the estate, or so I heard from Perkins, who's since left service. Sir Richard sent him packing. Proud man, Sir Richard. The Abbeys. Been in the Blackwood family for generations, and he'd not be the one to lose it, no matter how dire their financial straits." We lapsed into silence as the carriage wound its way through the bleak moorland. The daylight was fading rapidly, and snow had begun to fall in gentle flakes that dusted the landscape. Finally, as we crested a hill, Ravenscroft Abbey came into view. It was an imposing structure of gray stone, parts of it clearly dating back to its monastic origins in the 16th century, while other sections showed the renovations of subsequent generations. A square tower rose from one end, and Gothic windows punctuated the facade. Despite its grandeur, there was an undeniable air of melancholy about the place, a sense of faded glory and encroaching decay. As we approached, I noticed a figure standing at one of the upper windows, watching our arrival. The silhouette disappeared as soon as our carriage pulled up to the entrance. "Someone was observing our arrival," I murmured to Holmes. "Indeed." And with some anxiety, judging by how quickly they withdrew, Holmes stepped down from the carriage and surveyed the Abbey with keen eyes. "Note the east wing, Watson. Newer stonework, clearly rebuilt after the fire that claimed our ghostly organist's life." The massive oak door swung open before we could knock, revealing a thin, austere woman in her early 40s, dressed in dark green silk that had seen better days. Her face bore the remnants of considerable beauty, now strained by worry. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming." Her voice was cultured but tinged with urgency. "I am Lady Eleanor Blackwood. Please, come in out of the cold." The entrance hall was cavernous and dimly lit by oil lamps, their light insufficient to dispel the shadows that clung to the vaulted ceiling. The air was chill despite a fire burning in a massive stone fireplace, above which hung a portrait of a stern-faced man in hunting attire. "Sir Richard?" Holmes inquired, nodding toward. "The painting. My husband's father," Lady Eleanor replied. "Sir Richard is in his study and will join us shortly for dinner. I've had rooms prepared for you both. Our household is somewhat diminished these days, I'm afraid. 3 of our servants have left, citing the disturbances." "And these disturbances," Holmes said, removing his gloves. "They continue." Lady Eleanor's eyes darted toward the ceiling. "The music was heard again last night, Mr. Holmes, and another item has gone missing, a silver snuff-box that belonged to Sir Richard's grandfather. It was kept locked in a cabinet in the library." "I should like to examine the organ at the earliest convenience," Holmes replied. "Of course, after you've refreshed yourselves from your journey, perhaps. The chapel is in the west wing. It's seldom used now except when the vicar comes for special occasions." Lady Eleanor twisted her hands together. "I must confess, Mr. Holmes, my husband does not entirely approve of my having contacted you. He feels we should manage our affairs privately." "Yet the missing valuables surely warrant investigation," Holmes observed. "Sir Richard believes. That is, he's convinced the disappearances are somehow connected to the ghost of Jonathan Graves." A look of embarrassment crossed her features. "My husband is not ordinarily a superstitious man, but these events have affected him strangely." Before Holmes could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall, and I turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard descending the main staircase. His face was flushed, either from drink or anger, and his eyes, a piercing blue, fixed on us with undisguised hostility. "So," he said coldly, "the famous detective comes to Ravenscroft, to hunt ghosts, Lady Eleanor tells me." His tone made it clear what he thought of such an endeavor. "To investigate the theft of valuable property, Sir Richard," Holmes corrected mildly. "The supernatural elements are merely atmospheric." Chapter 3. The Chapel Organ Dinner. That evening was a strained affair. We dined in a grand but drafty room beneath the disapproving gazes of Blackwood ancestors whose portraits lined the walls. Sir Richard sat at the head of the table, occasionally glaring at Holmes as if his very presence were an affront. Lady Eleanor occupied the opposite end, her attempts at pleasant conversation falling flat in the frosty atmosphere. We were joined by Edward Marsden, Lady Eleanor's brother, a slight, nervous man with musician's hands and a tendency to startle at sudden noises, and Miss Sophia Blackwood, the distant cousin who served as companion to the Dowager Lady Blackwood. Miss Blackwood was perhaps 30 years of age, with sharp features and keen, observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "My mother sends her regrets," Lady Eleanor explained, noticing Holmes' glance at the empty place setting. "The Dowager Lady Blackwood rarely leaves her rooms these days. Her health is fragile. Yet her mind remains sharp as ever," added Miss Blackwood, her voice crisp and refined. "She is most curious about your methods, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps you might pay her a visit during your stay." "I should be delighted," Holmes replied. "I find that the elderly often observe what others overlook." Sir Richard snorted derisively. "Mother sees conspiracies everywhere. Age and isolation have made her fanciful." "Speaking of fancies," Holmes said, seamlessly changing the subject, "I understand the organ in your chapel has quite a history, sir." "Richard." The baronet's jaw tightened. "It dates from 1742. A master craftsman from Leipzig built it specifically for the chapel's acoustics." And the late organist, Jonathan Graves, he was talented, I presume? Edward Marsden leaned forward, eagerly. A genius, by all accounts. I've examined some of his compositions that survived the fire. Remarkable work, complex, innovative. Had he lived, he might have rivaled Bach. You're a musician yourself, Mr. Marsden? Holmes inquired. A modest one, yes. Nothing like Graves was said to be. Yet you can play the organ, Holmes persisted, tolerably. Well, Marsden admitted, a flush creeping up his neck. Though I haven't touched the chapel organ. Out of respect, you understand. Respect for the dead, Mr. Marsden? Holmes's voice was mild, but I detected the subtle probe beneath the question. Edward knows better than to disturb that instrument, Sir Richard interjected harshly. The last person who tried was found the next morning with his wits addled, claiming invisible hands had seized him. The groundskeeper's son, Lady Eleanor, explained softly. A simple lad, prone to flights of fancy. Yet the music continues to play, Holmes observed. Curious that a spirit so protective of its instrument would perform for an audience. Sir Richard slammed his hand on the table, causing the silverware to jump. I did not invite you here to mock our tragedy, Mr. Holmes. Richard, please. Lady Sir Eleanor's voice was strained. Mr. Holmes is only trying to help us. By dismissing what a dozen witnesses have heard with their own ears. Sir Richard pushed back from the table. I permitted this investigation out of deference to your wishes, Eleanor, but I will not sit here and be treated as a fool in my own home. With that, he strode from the room, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. I apologize for my husband, Lady Eleanor said after a moment. These events have affected him deeply. The Abbey is his heritage, his responsibility. To find it, haunted, is more than he can bear. Perhaps it is not the haunting itself that disturbs Sir Richard, Holmes suggested quietly, but what it represents. Miss Blackwood's eyes narrowed. And what might that be, Mr. Holmes? A loss of control, Miss Blackwood. Few things frighten men of Sir Richard's position more than forces they cannot command. Later that evening, after the household had retired, Holmes and I made our way to the chapel. The corridors were dimly lit by gas lamps that cast elongated shadows across the stone floors. Outside, the snow had intensified, and the wind howled around the ancient walls like a living thing seeking entry. What do you make of our hosts, Watson? Holmes asked as we walked. Sir Richard seems unusually agitated for a man who dismisses the supernatural, I replied, and his financial worries are evident in the state of the estate. Proud, but desperate. Excellent observations. And the others? Marsden seems harmless enough, though nervous. Miss Blackwood strikes me as formidable, extremely observant. Yes, Holmes agreed. She watches and listens. A valuable trait in a companion, though perhaps uncomfortable for those being observed. The chapel was located in the west wing, a beautiful Gothic space with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows. That would doubtless be magnificent in daylight. Now they were dark voids against the stone. At the far end stood the organ, its pipes rising majestically toward the ceiling. Holmes approached it with a reverence I had seldom seen him display. His fingers traced the intricate woodwork without, touching the keys. Magnificent craftsmanship, he murmured. A true masterpiece. He circled the instrument, examining it from every angle, occasionally kneeling to inspect something at closer range. Finally, he opened the bench and examined its contents. Sheets of yellowed music, some of them clearly ancient. Interesting, he said, holding one particularly worn sheet to the light. This composition is incomplete. The notation ends mid-measure, as if the composer were interrupted. Graves's unfinished masterpiece? I suggested. Perhaps. The style is certainly from the correct period. Holmes carefully returned the sheet to its place and closed the bench. He then proceeded to examine the floor round the organ, moving methodically outward in an expanding circle. "Holmes, what exactly are you looking for?" I asked, growing impatient with the silence. "Signs of frequent use, Watson. Dust patterns. Footprints." He paused, running his hand over one of the flagstones. "Come, look at this." I approached and saw what had caught his attention. A thin scratch in the stone, barely visible in the lamplight. "Recent," Holmes said, "made by something metal being dragged across the surface. And here," he pointed to the base of the organ, "a similar mark." Before I could respond, a sudden noise from the chapel doorway startled us both. We turned to find Edward Marsden standing there, a candle in his trembling hand. "I heard voices," he explained nervously. "I thought perhaps—" "Well, I thought the music might begin again." Holmes smiled reassuringly. "No ghostly performances tonight, Mr. Marsden. Only 2 curious investigators." "Did you find anything?" Marsden asked, approaching cautiously. "Nothing conclusive," Holmes replied, "though I should very much like to hear this organ played, by human hands, that is. Perhaps tomorrow you might demonstrate its sound for us?" Marsden paled visibly. "I couldn't possibly. Sir Richard need not know," Holmes interrupted smoothly. "A brief demonstration, purely for scientific purposes." Marsden hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well, tomorrow afternoon, when Sir Richard rides out to inspect the tenant farms." "Excellent. Now, I suggest we all retire. The hour grows late, and I suspect we may have an eventful day ahead. As we made our way back to our rooms, I couldn't help but feel we were being watched. The sensation of unseen eyes following our progress was so pronounced that I found myself glancing repeatedly over my shoulder, only to find empty corridors stretching behind us. "You feel it too," Holmes observed quietly. "Interesting." "What is?" "That in a house supposedly haunted by a musician's ghost, it is not music that disturbs us tonight, but silence." Chapter 4. Nocturnal Disturbances. I was awakened in the dead of night by Holmes's hand upon my shoulder. His face was alert in the dim light of a single candle he held. "Listen, Watson," he whispered. I sat up, straining my ears. At first, I heard only the winter wind howling around the eaves of the ancient building. Then, faintly but unmistakably, came the sound of music. A low, mournful melody played on an organ, its notes rising and falling with an almost human quality of lamentation. "The Ghostly Organist," I breathed, reaching for my dressing gown. "So, it would seem," Holmes replied, already fully dressed. "Come quickly, Watson, bring your revolver." We slipped into the corridor, which was as dark as a tomb save for Holmes's candle. The music grew louder as we approached the west wing, a haunting composition that sent involuntary shivers down my spine. It was not merely the skill with which it was played, but the profound sorrow expressed in each phrase, a musical articulation of deepest grief. "Beautiful, is it not?" Holmes murmured as we paused at the junction of corridors. "Remarkable emotional depth for a ghost." "You remain skeptical, then?" "Always, Watson. But I keep an open mind until evidence dictates otherwise." As we neared the chapel, the music abruptly ceased. We quickened our pace, Holmes extinguishing his candle as we approached the door, which stood slightly ajar. A faint light flickered within. Holmes gestured for me to remain silent as we crept forward. Peering through the gap, I could see the chapel was illuminated by a single lamp placed near the organ. But the instrument stood unoccupied, its keyboard untouched by mortal or spectral hands. The chapel appeared empty. Holmes pushed the door wider, its ancient hinges protesting with a low groan. We stepped inside, alert for any movement. The chapel was deathly silent now. The only sound, the distant moaning of the wind and the soft hiss of the oil lamp. "We are too late," Holmes said, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. Or perhaps we were meant to be. He approached the organ and examined it closely, running his fingers over the keys without pressing them. Still warm from use, he noted. Our phantom musician departed only moments ago. But how? I asked, bewildered. We would have seen anyone leaving. Holmes was examining the floor again, this time with particular attention to a spot near the wall behind the organ. Perhaps not, Watson, not if they knew of other ways to come and go. Before he could elaborate, we heard rapid footsteps approaching. Holmes straightened just as Lady Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face pale in her nightgown and wrapper, a candle clutched in her trembling hand. "You heard it too," she said. It was not a question. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "A most affecting performance. Tell me, Lady Eleanor, did Jonathan Graves compose as well as perform?" She nodded, entering the chapel with hesitant steps. Yes, he was known for his compositions. Sir Richard's grandfather was his patron, and recognized his genius early. He brought him from London to be the Abbey's resident organist and commissioned an oratorio from him, a work that was to be his masterpiece. "The one left unfinished at his death," Holmes supplied. "Yes, exactly. How did you know?" "I found the incomplete score in the bench last evening. The music we heard tonight, was it familiar to you?" Lady Eleanor's brow furrowed. "No. And yes. It had elements I've heard before when the ghost plays, but there was something different this time. More sorrowful. Interesting. And these performances, they always occur at night?" "Always after midnight, yes. And always when the house is quiet." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "I should like to speak with anyone who knew Graves personally. Is there anyone still living who might remember him?" "Only my mother-in-law," Lady Eleanor replied. "The Dowager Lady Blackwood was a young woman when Graves served as organist. She rarely speaks of those days, however. Nevertheless, I must insist on an interview with her tomorrow." Holmes turned his attention back to the organ. "Now, Lady Eleanor, perhaps you could enlighten me on another matter. These valuable manuscripts that have gone missing, where precisely were they kept?" "In Sir Richard's library, in a locked cabinet. Only my husband has the key, which he keeps on his person at all times. And yet they vanished without the cabinet being forced. Yes, it's most mysterious. Sir Richard is convinced the ghost somehow— I know how it sounds, Mr. Holmes, but these are strange times at Ravenscroft." "Strange indeed," Holmes agreed. "Tell me, does Sir Richard ever sleepwalk?" Lady Eleanor looked startled. "Not to my knowledge. Why do you ask?" "Merely exploring possibilities, Lady Eleanor. Now, I suggest we all return to our beds. I doubt our musical friend will perform an encore tonight." As we escorted Lady Eleanor back to her chambers, I noticed Holmes's eyes darting to every shadow, every alcove, as if expecting to find someone lurking in the darkness. Back in our rooms, he remained thoughtful, smoking his pipe by the dying embers of our fire. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, settling into an armchair opposite him. "Several possibilities present themselves, Watson. None entirely satisfactory yet." He tapped his pipe against the grate. "Did you observe the dust on the chapel floor?" "I confess I did not pay it particular attention." "You should have. It told quite a tale. There were fresh footprints, a man's, relatively small in size, approaching and leaving the organ. Yet they did not lead to any of the visible doors." "A secret passage?" I suggested. "Precisely. This abbey has stood for centuries, Watson. Monasteries of that era often contained hidden ways, escape routes for monks during periods of religious persecution. I suspect our ghostly organist is well acquainted with these ancient secrets. But the music, Holmes, it was unmistakably being played. We both heard it. Oh, yes, someone was certainly playing the organ. The question is, why adopt this elaborate charade? Why not simply steal the valuables without supernatural embellishment?" To frighten away the servants, perhaps? Fewer witnesses. Possibly. Or to create sufficient distraction that the thefts seem secondary to the haunting. Holmes steepled his fingers. We must speak with the Dowager Lady Blackwood tomorrow. I suspect she knows more about Jonathan Graves than she has revealed. And Marsden? He promised to demonstrate the organ. Yes, I'm particularly interested in hearing him play. Did you notice his hands at dinner, Watson? His hands? I observed they were a musician's hands, slender, nimble, and remarkably free of calluses for a practicing musician, Holmes added. Curious, wouldn't you say? The next morning we found the household in considerable disarray. Another item had vanished during the night, a small portrait in a gold frame that had hung in the main hall for generations. More disturbing still, cryptic words had been found scrawled on Sir Richard's study wall in what appeared to be red ink. The debt remains unpaid. Sir Richard himself was livid, his face flushed with rage as he paced the breakfast room where Holmes and I were dining alone, having risen later than the family. This is no ghost, Mr. Holmes. This is malicious mischief, designed to drive us from our home. I've sent for Inspector Thornley from the village. This is a matter for the police, not amateur theorists. As you wish, Sir Richard, Holmes replied calmly, buttering a piece of toast, though I would point out that the police have thus far failed to resolve your difficulties. May I ask who discovered the message? I did, Sir Richard snapped. When? I entered my study this morning. And the door was locked overnight? Of course, I always lock it. With a key that you keep? On my person, Mr. Holmes. I am not careless with my possessions. Indeed not. Most conscientious, Holmes murmured. I should like to examine your study, if I may. Sir Richard hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Very well, though I don't see what you expect to find that the police will not. One never knows. Sir Richard, Holmes replied with a faint smile. Sometimes the most revealing clues are those overlooked by official investigators. Chapter 5. The Dowager's Tale. Sir Richard's study was a handsome room paneled in dark oak, with heavy curtains and a massive desk positioned to command a view of the grounds. Books lined the walls, interspersed with hunting trophies, the mounted, heads of stags and one particularly fierce-looking boar. The atmosphere was one of masculine authority, now disrupted by the message scrawled across one wall in crimson letters. The debt remains unpaid. Holmes examined the writing without touching it, his keen eyes noting every detail of the lettering. He sniffed the air, then leaned closer to the wall, inhaling deeply. Not blood, he announced. A common vermilion ink, available in any stationer's shop, applied with a broad-tipped brush, not a pen. He turned to Sir Richard. The missing portrait, where exactly did it hang? Sir Richard pointed to an empty space on the wall opposite his desk. There. It was of my great-grandfather, the 7th Baronet. Not particularly valuable in itself, but a family heirloom nonetheless. And this cabinet, Holmes indicated a glass-fronted case filled with leather-bound volumes, is where the musical manuscripts were kept? Yes. As you can see, the lock is undamaged. Holmes peered at the lock, then at the floor beneath it, where he dropped to one knee for a closer inspection. Interesting, he murmured, more to himself than to us. Rising, he walked the perimeter of the room, pausing at the window to examine the catch. You believe the intruder entered this way? Sir Richard asked. No, Holmes replied. The dust on the sill is undisturbed, and there are no marks on the stonework outside that would suggest a climber. No, Sir Richard, your nocturnal visitor entered. By the door. That's impossible. I locked it myself. Nevertheless, that is what the evidence suggests. Holmes continued his circuit of the room, finally stopping before the massive fireplace. This chimney, it connects to others in the house, I presume? Several, Sir Richard acknowledged. It's part of the original heating system. Most of the fireplaces in this wing share a common chimney stack, including the one in the chapel. Sir Richard frowned. I believe so, yes. Why? Holmes merely smiled enigmatically. Might I trouble you for the key to your cabinet? I should like to examine the remaining manuscripts. After a moment's hesitation, Sir Richard produced a small key from his waistcoat pocket. Holmes unlocked the cabinet and carefully leafed through several ancient-looking folios, his expression thoughtful. These are all published works, he observed. Bach, Handel, Vivaldi. The missing manuscripts, they were originals. Yes, unpublished compositions acquired by my grandfather during his travels in Italy. Graves was studying them shortly before his death. He believed they contained musical innovations ahead of their time. Valuable, then, to the right collector. Extremely, but they would be difficult to sell openly. Their provenance is well documented. Holmes nodded, returning the key. And now, Sir Richard, I should like to interview the Dowager Lady Blackwood, if she is receiving visitors. Mother? Sir Richard looked surprised. Whatever for? She is the only person still living who knew Jonathan Graves personally. Her recollections may prove invaluable. Sir Richard's expression darkened. My mother's health is fragile, Mr. Holmes. I would not wish to distress her with these matters. I assure you, I shall be the soul of discretion. Dr. Watson, as a medical man, can monitor her condition during our conversation. Reluctantly, Sir Richard agreed, and soon we found ourselves being led by Miss Sophia Blackwood to the Dowager's apartments in the East Wing. As we walked, Holmes engaged our guide in casual conversation. You have served as Lady Blackwood's companion for some time, Miss Blackwood? 5 years, Mr. Holmes, since my father's death left me without means. A distant cousin of the family, I understand. My grandfather and Sir Richard's grandfather were brothers. Not so very distant, though circumstances have made it seem so. There was a trace of bitterness in her tone that Holmes clearly noted, though he made no comment upon it. Instead, he asked, And you have witnessed these ghostly manifestations yourself? I have heard the music, yes, though I have never seen anything supernatural. She paused before a polished oak door. Lady Blackwood is expecting you. She is having one of her better days, but please do not overtax her. The Dowager Lady Blackwood's sitting room was warm and bright compared to the rest of the Abbey, with a cheerful fire and windows that caught the winter sunlight. The lady herself sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, wrapped in shawls. Despite the warmth, she was ancient, her face a map of fine wrinkles, but her eyes were startlingly vivid and alert in their deep sockets. The great detective and his chronicler, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. Come closer, gentlemen. My eyes are not what they were. Holmes bowed over her offered hand. Lady Blackwood, thank you for receiving us. Curiosity, Mr. Holmes. At my age, one has a few entertainments. Sophia tells me you wish to discuss Jonathan. Graves. If you feel equal to it, yes. I understand you knew him personally. A shadow passed across the old woman's face. I did. He came to Ravenscroft when I was a young bride. A handsome man, intense, dedicated to his art. My husband's father brought him from London to compose his oratorio in peaceful surroundings. And the circumstances of his death, Holmes prompted gently. The Dowager's gnarled hands clutched at her shawl. Tragic. A fire broke out in the East Wing, where his quarters were located. He was trapped. The servants tried to reach him, but the flames. His rooms were directly above the old library where the fire began. Did you witness the fire yourself? Yes. I was the first to smell the smoke and raise the alarm, but it was too late. She closed her eyes briefly. They found him at his writing desk, pen still in hand. The oratorio score was partially destroyed. A terrible loss, both human and artistic, Holmes said. Was the cause of the fire ever determined? Officially, an overturned lamp, But there were rumors. What sort of rumors, Lady Blackwood? The old woman glanced at Miss Blackwood, who stood silently by the door. Graves had enemies, Mr. Holmes. His talent inspired jealousy, and his manner could be difficult. He quarreled with my father-in-law shortly before the fire. Over what matter? I never knew precisely. Something to do with the oratorio. My father-in-law was displeased with its direction. He had commissioned a work glorifying the Blackwood family history, but Graves had other ideas for his composition. She leaned forward slightly. The night before the fire, I overheard them arguing. My father-in-law threatened to withdraw his patronage unless Graves altered his work. And did he? There was no time. The fire happened the very next night. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. One final question, if I may. The phrase, "the debt remains unpaid." Does it hold any significance to you? The dowager's reaction was immediate and striking. Her face paled and her hand flew to her throat. Where did you hear those words? They were written on the wall of Sir Richard's study last night. Impossible, she whispered. No one living could know those words. She turned to Miss Blackwood. Leave us, Sophia. What I must tell Mr. Holmes is for his ears alone. Miss Blackwood looked surprised but obeyed, closing the door behind her. Now, Lady Blackwood, Holmes said when we were alone, please continue. The old woman's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Those words, Mr. Holmes. They were the title of Graves's oratorio, "The Debt Remains Unpaid," a work not glorifying the Blackwoods, but condemning them. Chapter 6. The Unfinished Oratorio. Condemning the Blackwoods, I echoed, unable to mask my surprise. On what grounds, Lady Blackwood? The old woman's hands trembled as she adjusted her shawl. That, Dr. Watson, is the heart of a secret long buried. The Blackwood fortune was not always honorably acquired. My father-in-law's grandfather, the 5th Baronet, was deeply involved in the slave trade. The family's prosperity came at a terrible moral cost. And Graves discovered this? Holmes asked quietly. Jonathan's mother was of West Indian descent. Mr. Holmes? Her grandmother had been enslaved on a Blackwood plantation in Jamaica. He accepted the commission from my father-in-law with the secret intention of creating a work that would expose, rather than celebrate, the family's past. How did he come to learn this connection? Through old family papers he found in the Abbey's library, records my father-in-law thought safely locked away. The dowager's voice grew stronger, as if unburdening herself of this long-held secret had given her strength. When my father-in-law realized what Graves intended, he was furious. He demanded the oratorio be abandoned and all Graves' research returned. And the fire that claimed Graves' life, you suspect it was not accidental? Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes fixed on the elderly woman's face. I have lived with that suspicion for 30 years, Mr. Holmes. I never voiced it, not even to my son. What good would it do? My father-in-law passed away 20 years ago, but I have never forgotten Jonathan Graves or the truth his music sought to tell. A truth that someone now seems determined to resurrect, Holmes observed. Did anyone else know about the true nature of Graves's oratorio? Only my father-in-law's valet, Perkins, the same man who served Richard until recently. She paused, her rheumy eyes suddenly sharp. You believe there is a connection between these events and Jonathan's death? I am still gathering evidence, Lady Blackwood, but I thank you for your candor. It has been most illuminating. Holmes rose from his chair. One final question, if I may. Do you believe in ghosts, Lady Blackwood? A faint smile touched her withered lips. I have lived long enough to know there are more things in heaven and earth, Mr. Holmes, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Whether Jonathan's spirit plays that organ, I cannot say, but I do know his unfinished work cries out for completion. We took our leave of the Dowager Lady Blackwood, finding Miss Sophia waiting in the corridor outside. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I sensed she was burning with curiosity about our conversation. "How did you find my aunt?" she inquired as she escorted us back toward the main part of the house. "Most informative," Holmes replied. "She possesses a remarkable memory for one of her advanced years. Yes, though sometimes she confuses past and present. Did she speak of Jonathan Graves?" "She did. She mentioned a quarrel between him and the late baronet over the direction of his commissioned oratorio." Miss Blackwood nodded. "Family legend has it that Graves became unbalanced toward the end of his life, obsessed with his composition. Some say he haunts Ravenscroft because his work remained unfinished." "A romantic notion," Holmes commented. "Tell me, Miss Blackwood, are you familiar with the Abbey's architectural history? I'm particularly interested in any modifications made after the fire." "The east wing was entirely rebuilt, of course. I believe there were also changes to the chapel and the old servant passages during the reconstruction." "Why do you ask?" "Professional curiosity, merely. Old buildings fascinate me." As we reached the main hall, we encountered Edward Marsden descending the staircase, a portfolio of music under his arm. "Ah, Mr. Marsden," Holmes called. "I believe you promised us a demonstration of the chapel organ this afternoon." Marsden started, nearly dropping his portfolio. "Mr. Holmes, yes indeed. Sir Richard has just departed for the tenant farms. We have perhaps 2 hours before his return." "Excellent. Shall we proceed to the chapel directly?" Marsden nodded, though his demeanor suggested he approached the task with considerable trepidation. As we made our way to the chapel, Holmes engaged him in conversation. "You studied music formally, Mr. Marsden?" "At the Royal Academy, yes, though I never achieved the recognition I had hoped for. My compositions were deemed derivative." There was a hint of bitterness in his voice. "I now teach music to the children of the gentry. It pays the bills, if little else." "And your interest in Graves' work?" "Professional curiosity, like your interest in old buildings," Marsden replied with a sidelong glance. "Graves was brilliant, innovative in ways his contemporaries couldn't appreciate. His use of dissonance and chromatic harmonies was decades ahead of its time." We reached the chapel, which in daylight revealed intricate stained glass depicting biblical scenes interspersed with what appeared to be episodes from the Blackwood family history. Marsden approached the organ with visible nervousness, setting his portfolio on the stand. "What would you like to hear, Mr. Holmes? Bach? Handel?" "I should prefer something of Graves's composition, if you know any." Marsden hesitated. "I have reconstructed portions of his oratorio from the surviving fragments. Would that interest you?" "Very much so." Marsden sat at the organ, flexing his fingers before placing them on the keys. After a moment's pause, he began to play. The music that filled the chapel was unlike anything I had ever heard. Haunting, complex, with an underlying current of what I can only describe as controlled fury. Discordant notes that should have been jarring somehow resolved into passages of breathtaking beauty before plunging again into turbulent, challenging sequences. Holmes closed his eyes, his face a study in concentration. As the music swelled to a particularly powerful passage, I noticed his fingers tapping against his leg, as if counting or marking time. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and stepped forward. "Enough, Mr. Marsden." The music stopped abruptly, the final notes echoing in the vaulted space. Marsden turned, his expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Is something wrong?" "That was not the music we heard last night," Holmes stated flatly. Marsden paled visibly. I don't understand." "I think you do. The composition you just played, while undoubtedly based on Graves' work, lacks the emotional depth and technical brilliance of last night's performance. You are a competent musician, Mr. Marsden, but you are not the one who played this organ in the dark hours." "That's absurd," Who else could it be? Marsden's voice had risen in pitch. That is precisely what I intend to discover. Holmes turned abruptly, his attention drawn to a small door half hidden behind a tapestry near the altar. What lies beyond that door, Mr. Marsden? Nothing of importance. A storage room for liturgical items, I believe. Holmes strode to the door and tried the handle. It was locked. The key, Mr. Marsden? I have no key. I've never been in that room. Then perhaps we should ask Lady Eleanor. Or, better yet— Holmes knelt and extracted a small case from his pocket, removing what I recognized as his lock-picking tools. We might investigate for ourselves. Before he could proceed, however, we were interrupted by hurried footsteps. Lady Eleanor appeared at the chapel entrance, her face distraught. "Mr. Holmes, thank heaven I've found you. Inspector Thornley has arrived from the village, and there's been another development, a most disturbing one." "What has happened?" I asked. "Another message has appeared, not in ink this time, but carved into the bark of the ancient oak in the Abbey grounds, and beneath it they found a body, Mr. Holmes, the body of Harrington Voss." Chapter 7. A body under the oak. The ancient oak stood at the edge of the formal gardens, its massive trunk gnarled and twisted with age. A small crowd had gathered. Sir Richard, having been summoned back from his ride, stood rigid with shock. Miss Blackwood hovered at the periphery, her face ashen, and a stocky, red-faced man in an ill-fitting suit, whom I took to be Inspector Thornley, was directing 2 constables in the grim business of examining the scene. The body of Harrington Voss lay sprawled at the base of the oak, his unseeing eyes staring up at the winter sky. He was a corpulent man in his 50s, expensively dressed with a heavy gold watch chain stretched across his substantial waistcoat. There was no obvious sign of violence, save for a thin trickle of dried blood from his left ear. "Mr. Holmes," Inspector Thornley acknowledged curtly as we approached. "Sir Richard mentioned you were staying at the Abbey. This is now a police matter. I must ask you not to interfere." Holmes merely nodded, his attention fixed on the tree trunk. Carved into the bark, the same message that had appeared in Sir Richard's study. "The debt remains unpaid." "When was the body discovered?" Holmes asked. "One of the gardeners found him. About an hour ago," Thornley replied. "Dead since last night by the look of him. Heart failure, most likely. The man was not in good health, judging by his appearance. And you believe his death to be natural?" Despite the ominous message carved above his body, Thornley's ruddy complexion darkened further. "I'm not discounting foul play, Mr. Holmes, but there's no obvious wound, no sign of a struggle. The message could have been carved before or after his death. Or perhaps its appearance caused a sufficient shock to induce a fatal seizure in a man with a weak heart," Holmes suggested. "May I?" He gestured toward the body. After a moment's hesitation, Thornley stepped aside. Holmes knelt beside the corpse, his keen eyes taking in every detail. He examined Voss's hands, his pockets, his shoes, and finally leaned in to smell the dead man's mouth. "Interesting," he murmured, rising to his feet. "Mr. Voss visited the Abbey last night, I take it, yet no one mentioned this to us." Sir Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "He arrived unannounced after dinner. We spoke briefly in my study, and he left. Or so I believed." "What was the nature of your conversation?" He repeated his offer, to purchase the Abbey. I again declined. "Was the meeting acrimonious?" Sir Richard hesitated. Voss was persistent. He suggested my financial situation would soon force my hand. I may have lost my temper. "And that was the last you saw of him?" "Yes, I escorted him to the door myself shortly before 10 o'clock. Holmes turned to Inspector Thornley. "I should like to examine Mr. Voss's personal effects." The inspector produced a small collection of items from his pocket, a wallet containing visiting cards and a substantial sum in banknotes, a gold pocket, watch, keys, and a folded document. Holmes inspected each item carefully, pausing over the document, which proved to be a letter. His eyebrows rose fractionally as he read it. "Most illuminating," he said, returning the items to Thornley. "I would draw your attention to two facts, Inspector. First, Mr. Voss has been dead for approximately 12 hours, placing his time of death shortly after his meeting with Sir Richard. Second, he did not die here. The body was moved." Thornley frowned. "What makes you say that?" "The distribution of livor mortis, the settling of blood after death, is inconsistent with his current position. Additionally, there are traces of different soil on his shoes than what we see here. I suggest you examine the chapel floor for corresponding traces." "The chapel?" Sir Richard exclaimed. "What possible reason would Voss have to visit the chapel?" "Perhaps he shared your family's interest in ecclesiastical architecture," Holmes replied cryptically. "Inspector, you will also wish to analyze the contents of Mr. Voss's stomach. I detected the distinct aroma of bitter almonds on his breath." "Poison?" Thornley's professional demeanor slipped, revealing genuine alarm. "You believe he was murdered?" "I believe nothing without sufficient evidence. But I suggest you telegraph for assistance from Scotland Yard. This case may exceed the resources of your local constabulary." This suggestion was met with visible resentment from Thornley, but to his credit, he nodded curtly. "I'll consider it, Mr. Holmes. In the meantime, no one is to leave the Abbey without my permission." As the police continued their work, Holmes drew me aside. "Watson, we must accelerate our investigation. The stakes have risen considerably." "You believe Voss's death is connected to the hauntings and thefts?" "Undoubtedly. All threads of this tangled skein lead back to Jonathan Graves and his unfinished oratorio." Holmes glanced toward the Abbey, his expression thoughtful. "I need to examine that storage room behind the chapel altar, and we must speak with Perkins, the valet who recently left Sir Richard's service." "You suspect him because he knew about Graves' true intentions for the oratorio." "I suspect everyone, Watson. But Perkins may possess knowledge crucial to our understanding. According to Lady Eleanor, he now resides in the village. We shall pay him a visit tomorrow." We returned to the house where the atmosphere had grown even more strained. Lady Eleanor was attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy by arranging afternoon tea in the drawing-room, but her trembling hands betrayed her distress. Edward Marsden sat at the piano, absently playing soft chords, while Miss Blackwood stared silently out the window at the police activity on the grounds. "This is intolerable," Sir Richard burst out as we entered. "A man dead on my property, my family under suspicion, my home invaded by police and journalists. This will destroy what remains of the Blackwood name." "Perhaps that is precisely the intention," Holmes remarked. Sir Richard turned on him fiercely. "What do you mean by that?" "Consider the evidence, Sir Richard. The ghostly music, the thefts, the messages, all designed to create a spectacle, to draw attention to Ravenscroft Abbey and its secrets. Your family history is being deliberately exposed. By whom, and to what purpose? That remains to be determined. But I believe Jonathan Graves is at the center of this web. Not his ghost, but his legacy." Holmes accepted a cup of tea from Lady Eleanor. "Tell me, has anyone recently expressed interest in his work besides Mr. Voss? A music scholar, perhaps, or a descendant?" Lady Eleanor and Sir Richard exchanged glances. "There was someone," Lady Eleanor said hesitantly, "a young woman who wrote to us several months ago, inquiring about Graves's time at Ravenscroft. She claimed to be researching forgotten English composers of the period." "Did you respond to her inquiry?" "Richard forbade it," Lady Eleanor replied, with a quick glance at her husband. "He saw no reason to revive old stories." "This researcher, do you recall her name?" Lady Eleanor frowned in concentration. "Matthews or Matheson, I believe." "Yes, Matheson, Eliza Matheson." Holmes set down his Teacup. And did she mention any institutional affiliation? A university or musical academy? I don't recall. The letter is probably still in my correspondence box. Would you like to see it? Very much so. While Lady Eleanor went to retrieve the letter, Holmes turned his attention to Edward Marsden, who had stopped playing and was listening intently to our conversation. Mr. Marsden, as a musician with interest in Graves's work, have you encountered this Miss Matheson in academic circles? Marsden shook his head. The name is unfamiliar to me. But then, my connections to academic music circles are limited these days. Lady Eleanor returned with a letter written on cream-colored stationery, which she handed to Holmes. He read it quickly, his expression revealing nothing. May I keep this temporarily? It may prove valuable to our investigation. Of course, Lady Eleanor agreed, thank you. Now, if you'll excuse us, Watson and I have matters to attend to before dinner. Once we were alone in our rooms, Holmes examined the letter more closely, even holding it up to the light. What do you make of it, Holmes? I asked. A forgery, Watson. Clever, but unmistakable. The paper is recent, artificially aged, and the ink contains chemical compounds not available 30 years ago. He tapped the signature. Our Miss Matheson is a fiction, a pretext for gathering information about Graves. Created by whom? Holmes folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. By the same hand that writes, "The debt remains unpaid," and plays the organ at midnight. Tonight, Watson, we shall set a trap for our musical ghost. Be prepared for a long vigil, and bring your revolver. Chapter 8. The vigil dinner that evening was a somber affair. Inspector Thornley had departed for the village to make arrangements for Voss's body, leaving a constable posted at the Abbey entrance. Sir Richard drank heavily, his face flushed with a combination of wine and barely suppressed rage. Lady Eleanor attempted to maintain conversation, but her efforts faltered in the face of her husband's dark mood and the pall cast by the day's events. Miss Blackwood and Edward Marsden exchanged glances throughout the meal, their silent communication not escaping Holmes's notice. The Dowager Lady Blackwood had elected to dine in her rooms, citing fatigue after our interview. Sir Richard, Holmes said during a particularly strained silence, I understand there are extensive cellars beneath the Abbey. Do they extend under the chapel as well? Sir Richard looked up from his wine-glass, his eyes narrowing. The foundations of this house date back to the 13th century, Mr. Holmes. There are cellars, crypts, and passages that even I have never fully explored. Why do you ask? Professional curiosity. Old buildings, as I mentioned to Miss Blackwood, fascinate me. If you wish to explore our cellars, you're welcome to do so, though I warn you, they're damp, rat-infested, and labyrinthine. Many of the passages were sealed during renovations after the fire. The fire that claimed Jonathan Graves' life, Holmes observed, a remarkable coincidence that the areas most damaged were his quarters and the library containing the family, records he had been researching. Sir Richard's face darkened further. If you're implying my grandfather was responsible for that fire, Mr. Holmes, I warn you, I imply nothing, Sir Richard. I merely observe patterns where they exist. Holmes turned to Marsden. You mentioned that Graves' use of dissonance and chromatic harmonies was ahead of his time. Might one say his compositions were revolutionary? Marsden looked startled at being directly addressed. In a musical sense, yes. He pushed boundaries that even Wagner approached cautiously. His work anticipated developments in composition that wouldn't become mainstream until the early 20th century. And the subject matter of his oratorio, this would have been equally revolutionary. I cannot say. I've only reconstructed fragments. The complete concept died with him. Or perhaps not, Holmes murmured. Perhaps it simply awaited the right moment to be reborn. After dinner, the party dispersed quickly. Sir Richard retreated to his study with a decanter of brandy, while Lady Eleanor retired to her rooms with a headache. Miss Blackwood announced her intention to read to the Dowager Lady, and Marsden disappeared toward the music room. Holmes and I returned to our chambers, where my friend spent nearly an hour meticulously examining the floor plans of the Abbey that he had somehow procured. Finally, as the clock neared 11, he rolled up the plans and turned to me. "Now, Watson, our vigil begins. We shall position ourselves in the chapel, but not obviously so. I suspect our musical phantom will be cautious tonight, knowing that Voss's death has heightened scrutiny of the Abbey. You believe the organist will still play, despite everything?" "I'm counting on it. Our adversary is committed to a performance that must reach its final movement. The discovery of Voss's body is part of the composition, not an interruption of it." We made our way silently through the darkened corridors, avoiding the creaking floorboards that Holmes had carefully noted during our previous visits. The chapel was eerily silent, illuminated only by what little moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows. Holmes led me not to the main floor, but to the small gallery above, which had once housed a choir. From this vantage point, we had a clear view of the organ while remaining hidden in the shadows. "Now, we wait," Holmes whispered, settling into a position that afforded him a view of both the organ and the small door behind the altar that had captured his interest earlier. The minutes stretched into hours. Midnight came and went. The Abbey creaked and settled around us, but no ghostly music disturbed the silence. My eyelids grew heavy despite my best efforts, and I found myself jerking awake several times, disoriented and stiff from our uncomfortable position. Just as I was beginning to think our vigil would prove fruitless, Holmes's hand closed around my wrist in a grip of iron. Instantly alert, I followed his gaze to the small door behind the altar, which was now opening slowly, silently. A figure emerged, cloaked and hooded, moving with cat-like grace toward the organ. In the dim moonlight I could discern no features, only that the figure was of medium height and slight build. It sat at the organ bench, removed the hood, revealing nothing in the darkness, and began to play. The music that filled the chapel was the same haunting composition we had heard the previous night. Sorrowful, passionate, and somehow accusatory, it spoke of betrayal, of justice long denied, of a debt unpaid. Even to my untrained ear, it was clearly the work of a master musician, played with technical brilliance and deep emotional understanding. Holmes's face was rapt, his eyes never leaving the mysterious organist. As the music reached what felt like a climactic passage, he finally moved, extracting a small bullseye lantern from his pocket and uncovering it with a dramatic flourish. "Enough," he called, directing the beam toward the organ. The music stopped. Abruptly, the figure at the organ froze, then turned slowly toward us. In the harsh light of Holmes' lantern, we beheld not a ghost, but a young woman of perhaps 25 years, with dark complexion, striking features and eyes that blazed with a combination of fear and defiance. "Good evening," Holmes said calmly, as if meeting a stranger at a social gathering rather than unmasking a phantom in the dead of night. "You must be Jonathan Graves's granddaughter." The woman's expression registered shock before quickly composing itself. "You are well informed. Mr. Holmes? I wondered how long it would take you to find me." "Longer than it should have, perhaps." The signs were there from the beginning. The musical skill far beyond Marsden's capabilities, the intimate knowledge of both the Abbey's layout and the Blackwood family history, the personal nature of this vendetta. "Not a vendetta, Mr. Holmes. Justice." Her voice was cultured, with the slight accent of someone educated abroad. "My grandfather was murdered because he dared to tell the truth through his art. His work was silenced, but I have restored it. And added your own movements to his composition, the ghostly music, the thefts, the threatening messages. A dramatic crescendo, culminating in Harrington Voss's death." Holmes kept the light trained on her as he and I descended from the gallery. "Tell me, did you kill him?" She lifted her chin proudly. "I did not need to. Voss poisoned himself with his own greed and ambition. Yet you moved his body to the oak tree and carved your grandfather's message above it. Why?" "Symbolism, Mr. Holmes. The Blackwood crest features a raven on an oak branch. Voss sought to acquire this place knowing its bloody history, intending to develop the land for profit. He deserved to lie beneath the symbol of the family whose crimes he would have helped conceal." Holmes had reached the chapel floor now, with me close behind him, my revolver drawn but pointed downward. "Your name is not Matheson, I take it," Holmes said, stopping a respectful distance from her. "Graves. Elena Graves. My father took my grandfather's papers to Jamaica after his death, including fragments of the oratorio. I was raised on stories of Jonathan Graves's genius and his betrayal by the Blackwoods. And now you've come to complete his work. To ensure it is heard," she corrected, "to force the Blackwoods to acknowledge their debt." "Even at the cost of murder?" Elena Graves' eyes flashed. "I told you I did not kill Voss, though I cannot say the same for Sir Richard." "What do you mean?" I asked, speaking for the first time. Her smile was cold. "Ask him about the brandy he served Mr. Voss last night. Ask him about the family's history of removing inconvenient obstacles. The Blackwoods have been silencing threats to their reputation for generations." Before Holmes could respond, a new voice cut through the darkness from the chapel doorway. "That's quite enough, Elena." Chapter 9. Revelations by Lamplight. We turned toward the chapel entrance to find Miss Sophia Blackwood standing there, a small pistol held steadily in her hand. Her face, usually so composed, was flushed with emotion, her eyes darting between Elena Graves and Holmes. "Sophia," Elena said softly without apparent surprise, "I wondered when you would show yourself." "You know each other," Holmes observed, his tone conversational despite the weapon pointed in our direction. "Oh, yes," Miss Blackwood replied, stepping further into the chapel. "Elena and I have been acquainted for some time, though she neglected to mention her true identity when we first corresponded." "A necessary precaution," Elena said. "I needed someone inside the Abbey, someone with access to the family's private rooms and papers. And Miss Blackwood, as a poor relation dependent on the family's charity, proved an ideal accomplice," Holmes added, resentful of her reduced circumstances yet intimately familiar with the house and its occupants. Miss Blackwood's mouth tightened. "My branch of the family was deliberately excluded from the Blackwood fortune, Mr. Holmes. My father died in poverty while Sir Richard lived in luxury, however diminished. When Elena contacted me with her research into the family's past, I was eager to assist. In theft and deception, in creating an elaborate haunting, I asked. In revealing the truth, she replied firmly. The oratorio that Jonathan Graves composed was not merely music, it was evidence. Evidence of how the Blackwoods built their fortune on human suffering, then buried their crimes beneath a veneer of respectability. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And the missing valuables? The family heirlooms and manuscripts? Evidence as well, Elena interjected. Documents proving the source of the Blackwood wealth. Silver bearing the family crest that was paid for with profits from their Jamaican plantation. My grandfather discovered it all while researching the family for his commissioned work. He was supposed to compose a celebration of the Blackwood legacy, Miss Blackwood continued, the pistol never wavering. Instead, he created a musical indictment. When the old baron realized what Graves had done, he arranged the fire that took your grandfather's life, Holmes finished, a theory, but not yet proven. I have proof, Elena said fiercely. Among my grandfather's papers was a letter he wrote the night before his death, expressing fear for his safety and entrusting his work to my father. The letter was never sent, but it clearly names the Baron as threatening him. A man's fears do not constitute evidence of murder, Holmes pointed out, though I agree the circumstances are highly suspicious. Miss Blackwood took another step forward. Enough discussion, Mr. Holmes. Elena and I are leaving tonight with what rightfully belongs to her family. The completed oratorio will be performed in London, along with a full accounting of the Blackwood crimes. And Harrington Voss? I asked. Was his death part of your plan for justice? Elena's expression darkened. Voss discovered our activities. He was more observant than we anticipated. He saw me entering the abbey through the old priest's door during one of his visits. He threatened to expose me unless I partnered with him. He wanted the abbey for development, caring nothing for its history or the truth we were trying to reveal. So you poisoned him, Holmes said. No. Elena's denial was vehement. I met him in the chapel that night to negotiate. He became ill suddenly, clutching his chest, gasping for air. He collapsed before I could do anything. A convenient heart attack? Holmes raised an eyebrow skeptically. I don't know what killed him, Elena insisted. But after he died, yes. I moved his body to the oak tree. It seemed fitting, a symbolic gesture, and carved your grandfather's message above it. That was my doing, Miss Blackwood admitted. Elena was distraught. I convinced her that Voss's death could serve our purpose, create more pressure on the family, more public attention. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Or perhaps more suspicion directed at Sir Richard, whom you both despise. The brandy Elena mentioned. Did you tamper with it, Miss Blackwood? Add a convenient poison to the glass intended for Mr. Voss? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Miss Blackwood's face, but was quickly suppressed. You cannot prove such an accusation. Perhaps not. But, Inspector, Thornley will certainly investigate now that he knows to look for poison rather than natural causes. The standoff was interrupted by a new sound, heavy footsteps approaching rapidly from the corridor. Miss Blackwood's grip on the pistol tightened. That will be Sir Richard, Holmes said calmly. He followed me earlier today when I examined the cellars, no doubt curious about my interest in the Abbey's foundations. He will have heard the music and our conversation. Then our time is short, Miss Blackwood said tensely. Elena, take the manuscripts and go. Use the passage behind the organ. Sophia, come with me, Elena pleaded. There's nothing for you here now. Miss Blackwood shook her head. Someone must ensure your escape. Go. Finish what your grandfather started. Before any of us could react further, Sir Richard burst into the chapel, his face contorted with rage. Behind him came Inspector Thornley, who had evidently returned to the Abbey. What is the meaning of this? Sir Richard roared, taking. In the scene before him, Elena at the organ, Miss Blackwood with her pistol, Holmes and I standing between them. The meaning, Sir Richard, Holmes replied evenly, is that we have found your ghostly organist. May I present Miss Elena Graves, granddaughter of Jonathan Graves. Sir Richard stared at Elena, his expression shifting from anger to shock. Graves? Impossible. He had no family. He had a son, Elena said, rising from the organ bench to face him defiantly. My father, who was sent away to Jamaica before my grandfather's death, before your grandfather murdered him to conceal the truth about your family's wealth. Preposterous, Sir Richard sputtered. My grandfather was a respected man. These are the ravings of a woman with proof, Holmes interjected. Miss Graves possesses documents and artifacts that tell a compelling story about the origins of the Blackwood fortune, a story that Jonathan Graves attempted to tell through his oratorio 30 years ago. Inspector Thornley stepped forward, his practical mind focusing on immediate concerns. Miss Blackwood, please lower that weapon, and Miss Graves, you'll need to come with me to answer questions about Mr. Voss's death. She didn't kill him, came a quavering voice from the chapel entrance. We all turned to see the Dowager Lady Blackwood standing there, supported by Lady Eleanor. The old woman's face was ashen, but her eyes burned with the same intensity I had noted during our earlier interview. "Mother!" Sir Richard exclaimed. "You should not be here. This is all a terrible misunderstanding that—" "No more lies, Richard," the Dowager interrupted with surprising strength. "I've lived with them too long already." She fixed her gaze on Elena. "You have your grandfather's eyes. He was a good man, a principled man." "You knew him well?" Holmes asked gently. "Better than anyone," she replied, a lifetime of secrets evident in her voice. "Well enough to know he would not want his granddaughter to throw her life away on a vendetta. No matter. How justified." Elena stared at the old woman, confusion written across her features. "What are you saying?" The Dowager Lady Blackwood drew herself up with dignity, seeming to gather strength from some internal reserve. "I'm saying that Harrington Voss was not murdered by you or by Sophia or even by my son. He was poisoned by me." Chapter 10. The Dowager's Confession. A stunned silence fell over the chapel. Sir Richard stared at his mother in disbelief, while Inspector Thornley appeared utterly confounded by this unexpected confession. Holmes alone seemed unsurprised, regarding the Dowager Lady Blackwood with quiet understanding. "Mother, you cannot be serious," Sir Richard finally managed. "This is some misguided attempt to protect—" "Be quiet, Richard," the old woman commanded with surprising authority. "I have remained silent far too long." She turned to Inspector Thornley. "I poisoned Harrington Voss with a preparation of prussic acid I've kept since my husband's time. He used it for photographic experiments. I added it to the brandy decanter in Richard's study, knowing it would be offered to Voss during their meeting." "But why?" Lady Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What had Mr. Voss done to you?" The Dowager's gaze shifted to Elena. "It was not what he had done, but what he intended to do. Voss discovered the truth about Jonathan, Graves, and this young woman's activities, not because he cared about justice, but because he saw an opportunity for profit. Blackmail," Holmes supplied. "He approached you directly, didn't he, Lady Blackwood?" The old woman nodded. "He came to my rooms the afternoon before his death, thinking me a senile old woman he could intimidate. He knew about Jonathan's oratorio, about the family's past. He threatened to support Elena's campaign to publicly expose the Blackwood history unless I convinced Richard to sell him the Abbey. His interest was never in the property itself," Elena said slowly. "He wanted leverage." "Precisely," the Dowager confirmed. "Once he owned the Abbey, he would have had the power to bury the story or expose it, whichever proved more profitable. He would have exploited both the Blackwoods and Jonathan's legacy." Holmes stepped forward. "You decided this could not be permitted." "I decided the cycle of exploitation had to end." The Dowager's voice trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "I have lived with the knowledge of what my husband's family did. I have carried the guilt of Jonathan's death. A death I could have prevented had I spoken up when my father-in-law threatened him." "You loved him," Elena said softly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You loved my grandfather." The Dowager, Lady Blackwood's composure finally cracked, a single tear tracing the wrinkled path of her cheek. "Yes, Jonathan and we found in each other something neither of us had expected. When he discovered the truth about the family's past, I was the one who helped him access the records. I believed the truth should be known, that the family should make amends for its sins." "Mother?" Sir Richard looked stricken. "You never said—" "How could I, Richard? After Jonathan died in that fire, a fire I have always believed your grandfather arranged, I was left with nothing but my duty, to the family I had married into. Your father never knew." "No one knew." Inspector Thornley cleared his throat awkwardly. "Lady Blackwood, I must inform you that this confession will require my arrest? Yes, she interrupted calmly. I am prepared for that, Inspector. At my age, the consequences matter little. Holmes had been watching the exchange with keen attention. Now he turned to Elena. You came to Ravenscroft seeking justice for your grandfather, never knowing that his greatest ally was already here, trapped. In her own web of silence and duty, Elena nodded, her eyes never leaving the dowager's face. I had no idea. All these years, I believed everyone at Ravenscroft had been complicit in his death. Not everyone, the old woman said. After the fire, I managed to salvage some of Jonathan's papers, notes for his oratorio that I concealed from my father-in-law. I always intended to find a way to preserve his work, to ensure it wasn't lost forever. But I lacked the courage. The sheet music in the organ bench, Holmes said. You placed it there. Years ago, yes. I couldn't bear to destroy it, yet I dared not keep it among my possessions. I thought perhaps someday someone might find it and understand. Miss Blackwood had lowered her pistol during this exchange, her expression one of confusion and dawning comprehension. You knew about our activities, didn't you? The night music, the messages. You were aware all along. I suspected, the dowager admitted. Old age has its advantages. People speak freely around someone they believe is disconnected from the present. I overheard your conversations with Elena when you thought I was sleeping. I could have exposed you, but I chose not to. Sir Richard looked from his mother to Miss Blackwood in mounting horror. Sophia, you helped this intruder create a fraud to destroy our family? Not a fraud, Richard, the dowager said before Miss Blackwood could respond. Elena is indeed Jonathan's granddaughter. I recognized her resemblance immediately from the photograph Sophia carelessly left in my room. She has his hands, his brow, and, clearly, his musical genius. Holmes nodded in agreement. Her playing is what convinced me. No impostor could have performed with such emotional connection to Graves' work. This was not mere technical proficiency, but the interpretation of someone with a deep, personal understanding of the composer's intentions. Elena looked at Holmes with surprise. You knew from the first night you heard the music, I suspected. Your nocturnal performances were not merely designed to create a ghostly atmosphere. You were completing your grandfather's work, piece by piece, weren't you? Using the chapel's acoustics to fully realize what had only existed in fragments. Yes, Elena acknowledged. The oratorio was his masterpiece, his testimony. I had to hear it brought to life in the space for which it was composed before taking it to the world. Inspector Thornley, who had been listening to these revelations with increasing bewilderment, finally reasserted his authority. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the facts. We have confessions to theft, breaking and entering, the desecration of Mr. Voss's body, and now murder. I must take the Dowager Lady Blackwood, Miss Graves, and Miss Blackwood into custody. Perhaps, Holmes said, before you do, Inspector, we might consider what justice truly requires in this situation. Justice requires the law be upheld, Mr. Holmes, Thornley replied stiffly. Indeed, but the law, as you know, provides for mitigating circumstances, for context that might inform how justice is administered. The Dowager Lady Blackwood raised her hand. I accept full responsibility for Voss's death, Inspector, but these young women were pursuing a truth long buried. If there is mercy to be shown, let it be for them. Sir Richard, who had remained silent during these exchanges, suddenly spoke. What exactly is this truth that everyone seems so certain of? These vague accusations about my family's past? What proof exists beyond an unfinished musical composition and family rumors? Holmes turned to Elena. The manuscripts and artifacts you removed from the Abbey, where are they now? Hidden in a rented room in the village, she replied without hesitation. Everything is there. Plantation ledgers, correspondence between the 5th Baronet and his Jamaican overseers, bills of sale for human beings. Her voice broke slightly. Including my great-great-grandmother. Sir Richard paled, the last of his bluster deserting him. I had no idea. I knew the family had West Indian interests, but not this. Few families examine the darker corners of their history, Sir Richard, Holmes observed, yet that history does not vanish simply because we turn away from it. As we stood in that ancient chapel, the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the stone floor. In that moment of silence, broken only by the dowager's labored breathing, we seemed suspended between the past and whatever uncertain future awaited. It was Holmes who finally spoke, addressing Inspector Thornley. I suggest, Inspector, that before formal charges are brought, all parties be given an opportunity to present the full context of these events, including the historical documents Miss Graves has collected. Thornley hesitated, clearly torn between strict adherence to procedure and the unusual circumstances before him. Justice, Holmes reminded him quietly, sometimes requires we look beyond the immediate facts to the deeper truths they reflect. Chapter 11. The Debt Acknowledged. The days that followed were filled with quiet intensity as the remarkable events at Ravenscroft Abbey unfolded toward their conclusion. Inspector Thornley, showing more wisdom than I had initially credited him with, telegraphed his superiors at Scotland Yard for guidance regarding the Dowager Lady Blackwood's confession. In the interim, she remained at the Abbey under nominal house arrest, while Elena Graves and Sophia Blackwood were permitted to stay in the village under police supervision. Holmes and I accompanied Inspector Thornley to examine Elena's rented room, where the missing items from the Abbey were found carefully preserved in leather portfolios and wooden cases. The documents she had collected told a damning story of the Blackwood family's involvement in the slave trade. Meticulous records of human beings bought and sold, correspondence discussing them as mere commodities, and plantation ledgers revealing the source of the wealth that had built Ravenscroft Abbey. These would be admissible in court, Holmes observed as we examined the papers. Historical evidence of considerable significance. Evidence of what, exactly? Thornley asked, perplexed. These practices, however repugnant to modern sensibilities, were legal in their time. Legal, yes, Holmes agreed, but not forgotten, Inspector. The past has a way of reaching into the present, demanding recognition. That is what Jonathan Graves understood, and what his granddaughter has risked everything to demonstrate. Upon our return to the Abbey, we found Sir Richard in the library, surrounded by family papers he had apparently never before examined closely. His face was drawn, his earlier bluster replaced by a subdued thoughtfulness. "Mr. Holmes," he acknowledged as we entered, "I've been conducting my own investigation into the family history. It appears Miss Graves's claims were not without foundation." "You seem surprised," Holmes remarked. "One inherits certain narratives about one's family, Mr. Holmes, tales of ancestral glory, of noble lineage. One rarely thinks to question them." He gestured to a faded portrait on the wall, a stern-faced man in Regency dress. "The 5th Baronet, my great-great-grandfather, the man who built the east wing of the Abbey and established the Blackwood fortunes. I was raised to admire him as a visionary businessman." "And now," I ventured. Sir Richard sighed heavily. "Now, I must reconcile that image with the man who wrote these." He indicated a leather-bound ledger open on the desk before him. Detailed instructions for the punishment of enslaved people who attempted escape, written in the same hand that penned loving letters to his children. Holmes nodded gravely. "History is rarely simple, Sir Richard. Most families contain both honor and disgrace in their lineages. Perhaps, but few have gone to such lengths to conceal their disgrace, even to the point of murder." He closed the ledger with a decisive movement. I have made a decision, Mr. Holmes. I will not contest Elena Graves' right to her grandfather's work, nor will I oppose her efforts to make the family's history known." "A commendable position," Holmes replied. "And the Dowager Lady Blackwood? What of her confession?" Sir Richard's expression grew troubled. "My mother's health is fragile. Prison would kill her within weeks. Yet she has admitted to murder, whatever her motivations." "There may be another way," Holmes suggested, "one that serves justice without destroying what remains of your family." That evening, an extraordinary gathering took place in the Abbey's drawing room. Inspector Thornley was present, along with a representative from Scotland Yard who had arrived on the afternoon train. Elena Graves and Sophia Blackwood had been escorted from the village, both looking apprehensive but resolute. Lady Eleanor sat beside her husband, while the Dowager Lady Blackwood occupied her usual chair by the fire, appearing somehow both frail and formidable. Edward Marsden was notably absent, having departed hastily for London upon learning of Elena's true identity and musical accomplishments. Holmes stood before the assembled company, assuming the role of mediator with his characteristic authority. "I have, with Inspector Thornley's permission, convened this meeting to propose a resolution to the complex situation in which we find ourselves." He turned first to the police officials. "The facts, as established through investigation and confession, are these. Valuable items were removed from Ravenscroft Abbey by Miss Graves with Miss Blackwood's assistance. A deception involving apparent supernatural manifestations was perpetrated by the same parties, and Mr. Harrington Voss died of poisoning administered by the Dowager Lady Blackwood." The Scotland Yard inspector nodded grimly. "Serious offenses, all." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, "yet context matters in the administration of justice. The items taken were not stolen for personal gain, but preserved as historical evidence. The deception, while theatrical, was designed to bring attention to a buried truth. And the poisoning," he paused, looking toward the Dowager, "was the act of an elderly woman seeking to protect both her family and the legacy of a man she had loved from exploitation by an unscrupulous blackmailer. The law cannot simply ignore murder, Mr. Holmes," the yard inspector objected. "No, but it can consider how justice might best be served." Holmes turned to Sir Richard. "Perhaps you should share your proposal." Sir Richard rose, his bearing dignified, despite the strain evident in his features. "I have discussed this matter with my mother and with my wife. We propose to establish a trust, using what remains of the Blackwood fortune, dedicated to two purposes. First, the preservation and performance of Jonathan Graves's complete oratorio. The debt remains unpaid. And second, the funding of historical research and education regarding Britain's role in the slave trade, with particular focus on the families and corporations that profited from it." Elena Graves looked stunned. "You would acknowledge it publicly? All of it?" "Yes, Miss Graves. The time for concealment is past." Sir Richard turned to the police officials. "In return, I ask for mercy for my mother. She has agreed to make a full written confession, but I request that she be allowed to remain at the Abbey under house arrest rather than face imprisonment at her advanced age." "And Miss Graves and Miss Blackwood?" Inspector Thornley inquired. "They would serve as trustees of the foundation alongside representatives of my family," Sir Richard replied. "Their expertise and personal connection to this history would be invaluable." The Scotland Yard inspector frowned. "This is highly irregular. I cannot simply dismiss criminal charges based on charitable intentions." "No," Holmes agreed, "but you can recommend leniency to the Crown Prosecutor, based on the extraordinary circumstances and the public interest in seeing historical justice served alongside legal consequences." A tense silence followed as the inspector considered this proposition. Finally, he spoke. "I will present your proposal to my superiors with Inspector Thornley's concurrence. I make no promises, but There is precedent for alternative resolutions in cases with significant mitigating factors. The relief in the room was palpable. Elena Graves, who had remained composed throughout, finally showed emotion, tears glistening in her eyes. My grandfather's work, his real work, will finally be heard? Yes, Miss Graves, Sir Richard confirmed. I give you my word. The Dowager Lady Blackwood extended a trembling hand toward Elena. He would have been proud of your perseverance, child, and your talent. Elena hesitated momentarily before crossing the room to take the old woman's hand. I wish I had known sooner that he had found love here, as well as betrayal. Sometimes, the Dowager replied softly, we must look beyond our first understanding of events to find the complete truth. Holmes caught my eye across the room, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In that moment, I understood that this resolution, imperfect, complex, but ultimately humane, was what he had been working toward from the beginning. As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for formal statements to be taken the following day, Holmes drew me aside. A most unusual case, Watson. Wouldn't you agree? Indeed, Holmes, though I confess I'm still not entirely clear on how you determined Elena Graves' identity so quickly. Music speaks when words cannot, my dear fellow. The emotion in her playing could only have come from a profound personal connection to the composer. Once I understood that, the rest was merely a matter of connecting the historical pieces. And the secret passage behind the organ? Holmes smiled. Ah, that. Most abbeys of this vintage contained priest holes and hidden ways, as I mentioned earlier. My examination of the original architectural plans revealed several such passages that were sealed during renovations, but evidently Miss Graves discovered one that remained accessible. Through the storage room behind the altar? Precisely. It connects to the cellars, which in turn lead to an exit concealed in the abbey grounds. Our ghostly organist was merely a talented young woman with a just cause and a knowledge of architectural history. As we prepared to depart Ravenscroft Abbey the following day, I found myself reflecting on Holmes's words about the past reaching into the present. The Blackwoods would face their history at last, while Elena Graves would complete her grandfather's unfinished masterpiece. As for the Dowager Lady Blackwood, her final years would be spent under restriction, but with the knowledge that her long-held secrets had finally been brought into the light. You know, Holmes, I remarked as our train pulled away from the station, in a way, this case did involve. Chapter 12. The Final Movement. 3 months after the events at Ravenscroft Abbey, Holmes and I found ourselves seated in the Royal Albert Hall, awaiting the premiere performance of Jonathan Graves's oratorio. The debt remains unpaid. The case had attracted considerable attention in the press, though the more sensational aspects had been carefully managed through the influence of Holmes's brother Mycroft and the discretion of Scotland Yard. The Dowager Lady Blackwood had, as proposed, been permitted to remain at the Abbey under a form of house arrest, her health too fragile for conventional imprisonment. Elena Graves and Sophia Blackwood had received suspended sentences, conditional upon their involvement with the trust established by the Blackwood family. Sir Richard sat across the auditorium with Lady Eleanor, both looking somewhat uncomfortable, beneath the weight of public scrutiny. The scandal had not been entirely contained, but the family's forthright acknowledgment of their history and their commitment to the trust had muted the worst of the criticism. Remarkable how these events have unfolded, I commented to Holmes as we surveyed the crowded hall. From a ghostly organist to a public reckoning with history. The most effective hauntings, Watson, are those rooted in genuine injustice, Holmes replied, scanning the program notes. Elena Graves understood that instinctively. Her theatrical approach may have seemed excessive, but it achieved what decades of more conventional appeals could not. And Voss's death? Do you believe the outcome would have been the same had the Dowager not taken such drastic action? Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Impossible to say with certainty. Voss was a shrewd opportunist who saw in the situation a chance for personal gain. Had he succeeded in purchasing the Abbey, he might well have suppressed the very history Elena sought to reveal, using the threat of exposure merely as leverage against the Blackwoods. A complicated moral calculation. Indeed, the Dowager made her choice based on a lifetime of accumulated regret. I cannot condone her methods, but I understand her motives. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience as Elena Graves appeared on stage. Though not conducting the orchestra herself, she had been instrumental in reconstructing her grandfather's composition from the fragments preserved by the Dowager and those her father had taken to Jamaica. She would perform the piano solos incorporated within the larger work. The oratorio began softly, almost tentatively, before building into the complex, emotionally charged piece we had heard fragments of at the Abbey. The music told a story without words, of suffering and exploitation, of complicity and denial, but also of resistance and, ultimately, of a reckoning long deferred. As the final movement reached its conclusion, I noticed something remarkable. Sir Richard Blackwood wept openly, his wife's hand clasped tightly in his own. Across 30 years and 2 generations, Jonathan Graves had finally spoken his truth to the family that had once sought to silence him. After the performance, we joined a small reception where Elena greeted us warmly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm so pleased you could attend. What did you think of my grandfather's work?" "Extraordinary," Holmes replied with genuine admiration. "He was indeed a composer of rare talent. The world is richer for having heard his voice at last." "Thanks in no small part to you," she acknowledged. "Without your intervention, I might now be facing a much longer imprisonment, and the oratorio might still be locked away in fragments." "You give me too much credit, Miss Graves. It was your determination that brought these events to their culmination. I merely helped shape the resolution." A slight commotion at the entrance drew our attention as Sir Richard and Lady Eleanor arrived. There was a moment of palpable tension before Sir Richard approached Elena directly. "Miss Graves," he said formally, "I want to express my appreciation for your artistry tonight. Your grandfather's composition is profoundly moving. He had a gift that transcended the circumstances of his life and death." Elena regarded him steadily. "Thank you, Sir Richard. That acknowledgment would have meant a great deal to him. The Trust has secured a permanent archive for all the documents you collected," he continued. "Scholars will have full access. Nothing will be concealed again." "And the Abbey," she inquired, "will remain in the family, but with a purpose beyond mere preservation of our status. We're converting the East Wing into a research center focused on Britain's colonial history." He hesitated, then added, "including an exhibition dedicated to your grandfather's life and work." I observed Holmes watching this exchange with quiet satisfaction. Though he had solved countless cases of greater danger and complexity, few had resulted in such a meaningful form of justice. Later that evening, as we relaxed in our rooms at Baker Street, Holmes sat smoking contentedly by the fire. A satisfying conclusion, wouldn't you say, Watson? Indeed, though not one likely to appear in the official records of Scotland Yard. Some cases are best measured not by convictions obtained, but by truths revealed. Holmes tapped his pipe thoughtfully against the grate. "The Blackwoods will never recover their former social position, but they have found a more honorable path forward. And Elena Graves has fulfilled her grandfather's legacy more completely than she could have imagined." "And the Ghostly Organist?" I asked with a smile. "What became of that particular spirit?" "Laid to rest, Watson. Not through exorcism or superstition, but through the more effective balm of acknowledgement and atonement." Holmes leaned back in his chair, sending a perfect smoke ring toward the ceiling. "Though I suspect the chapel at Ravenscroft may still occasionally echo with midnight music." "Elena maintaining the ghostly legend," I suggested. No, something more interesting. According to my last communication from Lady Eleanor, the Dowager has taken to playing the organ during her sleepless nights. It seems she is attempting to compose her own response to Graves's work, a companion piece she calls The Beginning of Repayment. I marveled at the strange turns the case had taken. From ghostly hauntings to musical reconciliation, not the outcome anyone would have predicted. The most interesting cases rarely end as one expects, Watson. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the firelight. Human nature has an infinite capacity to surprise, even someone as analytically inclined as myself. Will you write up the case for your monograph on musical crimes? I inquired, knowing Holmes occasionally published scholarly articles on specialized aspects of criminal investigation. I think not, he replied after a moment's consideration. Some stories belong not to the annals of criminology, but to the participants themselves. The riddle of the ghostly organist has found its proper resolution in music, not in legal precedent. As the fire burned low and the familiar sounds of London at night drifted through our windows, I reflected that Holmes was right. The case had begun with music, haunting, accusatory, demanding justice, and had concluded the same way, though transformed into something that spoke not only of historical wrongs but of the possibility, however tentative, of reconciliation. It ghosts of Ravenscroft Abbey had been real after all, though not supernatural. They were the persistent spirits of truth that refused to remain buried beneath generations of silence and denial. In exposing them to the light, Holmes had solved more than a mere riddle. He had helped resolve a human tragedy spanning decades. "You're contemplating the philosophical implications, Watson," Holmes observed with a knowing smile. "I can see it in your expression." "Merely thinking that not all hauntings require exorcism," I replied. "Some require only honest acknowledgement of the past." "Precisely." Holmes nodded approvingly. "And that, my dear Watson, is a lesson many would do well to learn in haunted abbeys and elsewhere.